Good evening, Rowan. It's the 27th of November 2016 and it's about 8:30. And obviously this is my usual Sunday evening video to reassure you I haven't been seducing any priests over the weekend, so you can relax. Because obviously I'm saving myself for my beloved, because he's so wonderful and sexy and has such magnificent feet. And we're made for each other. So anyway, I thought we could have a talk this evening about a lecture that you gave on the 2nd of November 2016 at Cambridge University. Now, I haven't been able to watch this whole lecture because the college where you gave the lecture has uploaded some excerpts from it in 9 separate videos onto YouTube, and they did that on Thursday or Friday last week. And none of the statements that you make is longer than 2 minutes long. None of the videos are longer than 2 minutes long. So I'm going to comment on 8 of them, because the first one, you're just setting out what you assume is the capitalist case there, and there isn't really anything very much of interest in it, and it's very short anyway, as are all of them. So here we go. So I'm starting with video number 2. Private vice produces public good. So you're setting out the case for capitalism here, what you assume is capitalism. Although what people tend to assume is capitalism these days is in fact corporatocracy, and they think of big business taking over the world, basically, and lobbying politicians and government agencies to have the legislation passed that they want. And a small number of people getting very rich off the labour of quite a lot of other people. So that's what people tend to think that capitalism is, although it isn't really. But I've explained this before anyway, and I might say a bit more of it in a minute. So private vice produces public good. That's to say, the motivation which capitalist practice assumes is a motivation which is self-directed. Well, all your motivations are self-directed, Rowan, as I've explained and illustrated many times. So you're saying that a self-directed motivation is inherently bad, whereas it isn't really. A self-directed motivation is quite an acceptable thing as long as you're behaving in a moral way towards other people, which you aren't, obviously, because you think the universe revolves around you, and that refusing your sex is the moral equivalent of leaving you battered and bleeding at the side of the road. So self-directed motivation isn't necessarily bad, like trying to make the best of your life and make a good life for yourself and your family. That isn't a bad motivation if you're not behaving in an immoral way towards other people. So you say it's about giving oneself, and you emphasise self, more property, more resource, more opportunity. So what's wrong with that then, Rowan? Because you've got a lot of property and resource and opportunity. You've had a lot of opportunities that you shouldn't really have had, and you wouldn't have had in a meritocracy. It's only because you were being puppeteered by these globalist control freaks who want to ruin everybody and get rid of them. So you've got plenty of resources. You've been on a very high income, which you didn't deserve because you were useless and corrupt and deliberately subversive. So you've had these opportunities, and let's talk about property as well, because you do own at least 2 houses, don't you? And you live in a third that comes with your job. So that's a surplus, really. So you wouldn't be able to have a surplus in a communist system, would you? Because there probably wouldn't even be enough to go around. So let's look at the Soviet Union there, which I've mentioned before, that there were famines on a regular basis in the Soviet Union. Part of this was engineered to suppress political opponents of whoever was ruling the place at the time. But some of it was just the fact that central planning simply doesn't work because the people in charge of the government don't tend to know a lot about farming and supplying food and the market forces of supply and demand and all that kind of thing. So a farmer isn't going to grow a lot of rice if nobody's eating rice, for example. So but if the government's controlling everything, then they can say, well, just grow the rice, can't they? Even though nobody wants it, or there's too much, and it ends up on a massive mountain, like the massive surpluses of the European Union, which you're also in favour of. So, that's what central planning does, which I've also spoken about before when I was talking about the book review that was written by you and published in the New Statesman in October 2016. So you've got plenty of resources, opportunities and property, but you seem to want to take that away from other people. So by some miraculous or providential arrangement, the sum total of individual and corporate selfishness produces social benefit and social good. Well, it produces more social good on the whole than the communist system, because I've just talked about the famines and the surpluses of central planning. And also people in the Soviet Union, even when there wasn't a famine going on, found it very hard to get the basic necessities of life, staple items of food like bread, for example. They were having to spend large amounts of time queuing just to buy bread and potatoes and things like that, and clothing as well. There was a shortage of clothing. So that's central planning for you. So the individual selfishness, as you put it, that you're complaining about is actually more beneficial to society as a whole than central planning, because people can't, who want to make money and make a nice life for themselves, they want to supply the goods that people want to buy and that people need to live by, like food and clothing. And then if there's a surplus, then there's more luxury items can be available, as we have in the West at the moment. So this selfishness that you're complaining about does produce more social good than the alternative that you tend to be proposing, which is central planning, which you're rather vague about the details of the alternative that you're proposing. You're just saying that we don't want all this capitalism, even though you've benefited enormously from it, and don't show any signs of relinquishing these benefits that you've gained from the capitalist system. And also, of course, you wouldn't have been allowed to practice so openly as an apparent Christian in a communist country, would you? Because they try to stamp out religion. But you're not a Christian anyway, so you're probably not too bothered about that. So it says, but this is a paradox or problem because it suggests that public or common benefit is accidental. Well, it doesn't really, because you've got individual people planning, haven't you? People who know how to grow food, people who know how to manufacture things, people who know how to supply and sell things. So they're doing all the planning rather than a government doing the planning, and they go out of business immediately if they were supplying things that people didn't want or need, and also if they didn't supply things that people did want. So it's not accidental that bakers bake bread. It's not accidental that that benefits the public, because the public want the bread, and so the bakers bake the bread, and there's no need to get the government involved in that. And also, you tend to be operating from the assumption that if we had some central planning going on that was controlling all of these things to a greater extent than they are at the moment, then the people who are controlling everything are going to be benevolent, and they're not going to be corrupt and stealing and that kind of thing. So you're assuming that the business people and the bakers and the distributors and the farmers and all these people who are actually producing something useful that people need and want, they're somehow morally deficient, directed by selfishness, and this kind of thing. But then if we put some people in charge of all of this, then those people are going to be so benevolent and selfless and altruistic and all this kind of thing. So I'm not too sure why people who want to grow food and manufacture things are selfish and lacking any virtue, but people who want to be in control of everybody, they're the virtuous, moral ones. I can't really see where you're coming from there, because people who want a lot of power tend to be the people who really shouldn't be exercising any power. So, but this is a paradox or a problem, because it suggests that public or common benefit is accidental. It only happens when you're not thinking about it. Well, this is nonsense, because the people who are making business plans and so on are obviously thinking about it. Otherwise, they'd be bankrupt in 5 minutes, wouldn't they? You don't know what you're talking about.
Private vice produces public good. That's to say, the motivation which capitalist practice assumes is a motivation which is self-directed. It's about giving oneself more property, more resource, more opportunity. By some miraculous or providential arrangement, the sum total of individual and corporate selfishnesses produces social benefit and social good. But this is a paradox or a problem, because it suggests that public or common benefit is accidental. It only happens when you're not thinking about it.
Capitalism proclaims that it is on the side of liberty and the maximisation of opportunity. Well, this is already quite interesting, because capitalism doesn't actually proclaim anything, does it? It's an abstract, a concept. Only people can proclaim things. So I think this is another example of your difficulty with abstract thinking, and that you don't understand the difference between concrete things that actually exist, things that exist like human beings, and things that are abstract like society, for example. And I've talked before about you attributing to society qualities that only individuals can possess. So I think this is another example of that. Capitalism can't proclaim anything, only people can proclaim things. So somebody could proclaim that capitalism is on the side of liberty and the maximisation of opportunity, but capitalism itself can't proclaim anything. So you then say, historically, however, it's been associated with the sacrifice of power or liberty by individual producers or groups of producers, particularly vis-à-vis their labour. So what system then wouldn't be associated with the sacrifice of power or liberty then, by producers or groups of producers, particularly vis-à-vis their labour? Because you're a communist and you're promoting communism, so do people not work in communist societies then? Is that what you're saying? And when we talk about liberty, nobody has absolute liberty, because everybody has to work to some extent and to do things that they don't want to do. There's very few people in the world who have the kind of liberty that you're talking about. And in fact, it seems so extreme that you'd have to be a disembodied consciousness floating around in the ether somewhere to have this kind of liberty that you're implying. The point is, in capitalist societies, that you've got more choice about what work you do, and if you've got the aptitude and the desire, you can set up your own business, and you can work more for the benefit of yourself. And if you don't want to do that, then you can go and work for an employer. And if the economy is working well, then you should have quite a lot of choice of employers, and therefore you've got more bargaining power, you know, for wages and what kind of job you want to do and that kind of thing. So I don't really know what society would have the kind of liberty that you're talking about. I think it's a fantasy. You want to criticise capitalism, even though you don't know, or you're pretending that you don't know what capitalism really is. So then you say that the major intuition of Karl Marx that the problem of capitalism is the alienation of the producer from what they produce. So this sounds like postmodernism to me. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. It's the kind of noise pollution that you'd come out with. What does the alienation of the producer from what they produce even mean? What does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything. And in any case, who knows if Karl Marx even said it with the stuff that you come out with and say that people said when they didn't say, and that kind of thing. So I don't know what it means, and I don't take your word for it that Karl Marx even said it. Anyway, I've got some information about Karl Marx from a couple of other videos that other people have made about him, which I'm going to present later in the video, but I am going to just show a clip after this, because you're always lambasting Donald Trump for being racist and anti-Mexican and anti-Muslim and all this kind of thing, and he's a terrible bigot, even though you've never provided any evidence for that whatever. But in fact, Karl Marx was a terrible bigot. He was anti-Semitic. He made racist remarks about people of African origin. And so I can't understand why you're such a big fan of his, that you're talking about his intuitions and this kind of thing. But you seem to be able to overlook his rampant racism, and yet you have to invent allegations of racism against other people. And you've also called me anti-Semitic as well in the past because I criticised the Rothschilds. And so anyone who says what you don't want them to say and doesn't do what you want them to do, or hold the opinions that you want, or be in with the right people and that kind of thing, then they're racist and sexist and homophobic and all this kind of thing. And anything else, anti-Semitic, and anything else you can think of to slur them with. Yet Karl Marx was actually racist. He was also sexist, by the way, but I haven't put any clips in about that. But anyway, so I'm going to show a clip in a minute about some of his abject racism, and what I want to know from you is, why aren't you criticising Karl Marx and saying that no one ought to ever listen to him because of his rampant racist ideology? So you then say, oh yes, the other point I wanted to make about Karl Marx here, you say the major intuition of Karl Marx. Well, it would have to be an intuition, wouldn't it? Because he was completely incompetent in every area of his life. So all he could do was have intuition, because he couldn't substantiate anything he said with any evidence, and there's some information about that later in the video as well. So you then say, more specifically than that still, as a matter of historical fact, a great deal of the energy of early capitalism derived from the slave-supported economies of early empire. So you've emphasised this word energy again, and the reason for that is because in a letter I wrote complaining about David Peat sexually harassing me in 2004, I said that the energy behind his persistent harassment, he never seemed to tire of it. I said I believe this energy was satanic. So you've tried this strategy numerous times before, emphasising this word energy in relation to Christian saints. And I said before, oh, you're trying to make me think that David Peat was really a saint. And you think by emphasising the word energy, you're going to convince me of that. So you didn't convince me of that. So you're now emphasising the word energy here to try and convince me that capitalism is satanic. And I suppose communism is divine then, by extension of that. Well, what I really need, Rowan, if you want to convince me that capitalism is satanic and communism is divine, I need some evidence. So these techniques of neuro-linguistic programming, word wrapping, don't work. I've told you that about 1,000 times as well. So you present the evidence and I'll accept your point of view, but I need to see the evidence first. And if you had any evidence, you wouldn't need to be playing stupid games like this, would you? So you then say, so the paradox of the 17th and 18th centuries, the paradox of the Enlightenment, is that it was an age in which a system proclaiming the maximisation of liberty rested systematically on the enslavement of particular agents. Well, you're supposed to be talking about capitalism here, and you seem to be talking more about the Industrial Revolution and more about the institution of slavery in the New World, although certain people in Britain did benefit from that as well. They were slave traders, but we didn't really have slaves in Britain to that extent, not African slaves brought here, a minuscule number anyway, where it happened at all. But the point about capitalism, you see, Rowan, which you clearly don't understand, that it's based on free trade and free association. So if somebody's enslaved within that and doesn't have the liberty either to sell their produce, sell their goods, or sell their labour, and to make a decision about what they're going to do about that, then that isn't really capitalism. Slavery isn't inherent to capitalism. In fact, it's the antithesis of capitalism because there's no free association there. So you're presenting something. It was private individuals who were doing this to a large part, were trading slaves and owning slaves in the New World. But that doesn't mean that this system is intrinsic to capitalism. And so saying that the maximisation of liberty rested systematically on this enslavement of particular agents, I mean, it just isn't true, is it? Because slavery was abolished and liberty for everybody really has increased even more since the abolition of slavery. I know they're trying to enslave us all now again, and obviously they're putting up taxes more and more to pay off all this national debt, and there's taxes on everything now that we buy, just about. So we're half enslaved anyway by having to pay all these taxes, because if you're a slave, then 100% of what you produce or earn, it is given over to the person who owns you. You don't have anything yourself. They only give you enough food and somewhere to stay. So you don't really own anything yourself as a slave because you're giving over the whole fruit of your labour. So you're proposing taxation, more taxation, everybody paying taxation, global taxation, and you want a society where people are proud of the amount of tax they pay. So why isn't that a kind of slavery then, that you have to give over a percentage of your labour, it's taken from you by force? So that's a kind of slavery as well, and it's what you're proposing. And also, of course, if you're not actually directly owned by anybody, then you're responsible for providing your housing and food and clothing, aren't you? Whereas your owner would be if you were entirely enslaved. So taxation is almost the best of both worlds. So you're promoting a kind of enslavement, and you're claiming that you're speaking for liberty, whereas everything's the opposite way around as usual.
Capitalism proclaims that it is on the side of liberty and the maximization of opportunity. Historically, however, it's been associated with the sacrifice of power or liberty by individual producers or groups of producers, particularly vis-à-vis their labor, the major intuition of Karl Marx, that the problem of capitalism is the alienation of the producer from what they produce. More specifically than that, still, as a matter of historical fact, a great deal of the energy of early capitalism derived from the slave-supported economies of early empire. So the paradox of the 17th and 18th centuries, the paradox of the Enlightenment even, was that it was an age in which a system proclaiming the maximization of liberty rested systematically on the enslavement of particular agents.
In 1843, Bruno Bauer, the anti-Semitic leader of the Hegelian left, published an essay demanding that Jews abandon Judaism completely. And Marx wrote some essays in reply to this. He didn't object to any of the anti-Semitism. Indeed, he shared it, he endorsed it, he quoted it with approval. But he disagreed with the solution. He rejected Bauer's belief that the antisocial nature of the Jew was religious in origin and could be remedied by tearing the Jew away from his faith. In Marx's opinion, the evil was social and economic. So this is what he wrote. He said, "Let us consider the real Jew, not the Sabbath Jew, but the everyday Jew. What was the profane basis of Judaism? Practical needs, self-interest. What is the worldly cult of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money." And so he wrote that the Jews had gradually spread this practical religion to all society. He wrote, "Money is the jealous god of Israel, beside which no other god may exist. Money abases all the gods of mankind and changes them into commodities. Money is the self-sufficient value of all things. It has therefore deprived the whole world, both the human world and nature, of their own proper value. Money is the alienated essence of man's work and existence. This essence dominates him, and he worships it. The God of the Jews has been secularized and has become the God of this world."
All of this underlines a basic argument which is summed up by Zamanier when he says in an article that market exchange is ethically acceptable if it complies with and does not destroy the principle of reciprocity. Who's entitled to say that market exchange isn't acceptable anyway? Who's in charge of the world to say that market exchange isn't acceptable? And also, I just want to point out here that you're looking at a screenshot of the prophet Amos. This is a book of the prophet Amos in the Old Testament. And here he is railing against the exploitation of the poor and corrupt business practices. And this really illustrates that this problem is as old as the hills. It's never been any different, and it isn't a problem of capitalist society. It's a problem of corrupt human beings who behave in an unethical way. And changing the system from capitalist to communist isn't going to improve human nature at all. And in fact, as I've already said earlier on, it tends to be the most corrupt people who want the most power anyway. So it's actually detrimental to poor people who would be disadvantaged, more disadvantaged in any system due to a relative lack of resources and power. So we can't change human nature by changing to a different political system anyway. And capitalism does afford the most freedom, providing there aren't governments and government agencies to be implementing policies and passing laws which benefit the phenomenally wealthy, who do exert control over a number of political leaders, like Hillary Clinton, for example, who seemed to be your favoured candidate in the presidential election, which is why you've never uttered a word of criticism against her that I'm aware of. So that's to say, capitalist practice is for him ethical when it intensifies a sense of mutual obligation, and you raise your voice an octave there on obligation, and mutual dependence, and you emphasise dependence. So you're trying to sound authoritative when you're talking about obligation. So I'd just like to point out at this moment that I'm not obligated to you for anything. In fact, you're obligated to me to compensate me for all the evil things you've been doing to me since 1992. So if you want to talk about obligation, you're obligated to me, Rowan. It's not the other way around. And I'm not dependent on you. In fact, it would be beneficial to me if you didn't exist at all, which I've also said before. For that to be a reality, the practice in question must be one which genuinely increases rather than denies the agency of all. The problem, therefore, in Zemanie's world with classical unregulated capitalist practice is that it depends on denying the agencies of some. And you emphasise denying and raise your voice an octave on some. So you're using these techniques again to try and sound authoritative. Well, my problem is, who's going to be regulating the capitalist practice then? Because you want a big government passing a lot of laws and controlling everybody with the ultimate aim of exterminating virtually everybody, don't you? And since I've already talked about the lunacy of the communist system, I won't say another word about it now. The alienation of the producer from the product. So I don't know what this means. This is more Marxist nonsense, isn't it? It doesn't even mean anything. It's like postmodernism and the kind of noise pollution that you frequently come out with. Almost invariably, in fact. In the alienation, for example, of the imperial, and you raise your voice an octave there, and colonial power from the subaltern race, which is the source of cheap labour and so forth. So, as I've said, this isn't a problem of capitalism, it's a problem of corrupt human beings. And this problem has existed from the beginning of time. It hasn't been invented in recent centuries.
All of this underlines a basic point which is summed up by Zemanie when he says in an article that market exchange is ethically acceptable if it complies with and does not destroy the principle of reciprocity. That's to say, capitalist practice is for him ethical when it intensifies a sense of mutual obligation and mutual dependence. For that to be a reality, the practice in question must be one which genuinely increases rather than denies the agency of all. The problem, therefore, in Zemanie's world with classical unregulated capitalist practice is that it depends on denying the agency of some, in the alienation of the producer from the product, in the alienation, for example, of the imperial and colonial power from the subaltern race, which is the source of cheap labor, and so forth.
The problem of capitalism today is not so much criticism from outside the system, it's the failure of the market itself in an unstable and violent world. Well, the world is unstable and violent because of psychopaths like you, largely, isn't it, Rowan? So you're presenting yourself as the solution here, whereas in fact you're the problem. Marx famously noted the void at the heart of capitalism. So I've talked about you having a void at your centre where your personality should be. I think I've mentioned that in a previous video. And the fact that you don't have any formed character, all you are is a series of masks that you put on to try and manipulate the outcome that you want from other people. So you then say what he called the fetishism of exchange. So it isn't a coincidence here, I think, that you've decided to talk about fetishism, because I had been quite recent to this video, this lecture that you gave in this video, drawing attention to the fact that you appear to be into S&M and all kinds of kinky things. At the end of the day, if everything is exchangeable, everything has a price, and you emphasise price. Well, I haven't got a price, Rowan. I'm not for sale. So zip your trousers up and fuck off. Nothing is anything in itself. I don't know if that's what Marx is saying. All you have is the circulation of, well, what? All you have is circulation. So I think you're telling me here that it's just going to go on round and round in circles forever, like it's been doing for the last 8 years, and like it's been doing to a lesser extent all the time you've been interfering in my life. So as I've told you now about 50 times, both of us are going to drop dead one day, and you'll probably drop dead first. So it can't go on forever, Rowan. It is finite, whatever happens, so don't bother with that strategy again. All you have is circulation. All you have is, you might say, quite literally, a string of noughts. So you're telling me I'm bankrupt again, even though I'm not bankrupt, but you like to say that I'm bankrupt, and keep re-emphasising this, because, as I've said before, psychopaths can't learn. And I think this lecture was before the video I made about the talk that you gave in St Martin in the Fields at the beginning of October. This was after the one that you gave on the 19th of September, where you thought I was in the audience, and you were quoting Sash lyrics to me, something like, I can't believe that tonight you're here with me, or something to this effect, you make my body come alive. You weren't quoting it like that, but you were referring to this song that I'd used in a video about you, the video of it I'd used in a video about you, and I've made a video about that. And then you did exactly the same thing over again on another talk that you did a couple of weeks later in St Martin in the Fields, and I made a video about that, and I said this is exactly what I mean when I say psychopaths can't learn. A normal person would think, if I do all this stuff over again, if I say it all again, she's just going to put another video on YouTube, draw attention to what I'm saying, and that'll make me look even worse than I do already. And so you're doing this thing again here, but I think it's before the video that I did where I was drawing attention to the fact that this is what I meant when I said psychopaths couldn't learn. So All you have quite literally is a string of notes. So I think you're telling me here that I've only got a string of notes. But let's put it this way, Rowan. I'd rather have a string of notes than have anything to do with a psychopathic slime ball like you. And if you'd learnt that early on, you would have spared yourself all this trouble, and obviously spared me all this trouble as well. But you can't learn because you're a psychopath and you're so extremely narcissistic. You think the universe revolves around you and that you're God and you have to have your own way. And you've actually just made yourself feel worse and worse, haven't you? Because as you've escalated the abuse of me to try and force me to give you what you want, and then I've still rejected you, it's an even bigger rejection, and every rejection is bigger than the last one because of what you've put me through to try and force me to associate with you and to give you what you want. So it's an even bigger rejection that I've been through all of this and I'm still rejecting you. So you've made the rejection of you even worse than it was at the beginning. So you brought all this on yourself.
The major problem of capitalism today is not so much criticism from outside the system, it's the conspicuous failure of the market itself in an unstable and violent world. Marx famously noted the void at the heart of capitalism, what he called the fetishism of exchange. At the end of the day, if everything is exchangeable, if everything has a price, nothing is anything in itself. All you have is the circulation of, well, of what? All you have is circulation. All you have is, you might say quite literally, a string of noughts.
Last night you slept on a goose feather bed, she turned down so bravely, oh. Tonight you'll sleep on the card-held ground, along with the raggle-taggle gypsies, oh. What care I for a goose feather bed, she's turned down so bravely, oh. Tonight I'll sleep by my lover's side, along with the raggle-taggle gypsies, oh.
So I just want to comment again on this string of noughts that you've just mentioned. So let's talk about fractional reserve banking, where the banksters just generate money out of nothing when an agreement is signed to repay the money with interest. So that isn't capitalism because there's no capital there, is there? It's just been invented, created out of thin air, this counterfeit currency. So that isn't part of the capitalist system. And I would also point out, as I pointed out before, that Vladimir Lenin said that establishing a central bank was 90% of communising a nation. So virtually every nation on earth has a central bank now, controlled by the Rothschilds. So by all means criticise the present system, but it's quite unreasonable to call it capitalist when there's so many planks of the Communist Manifesto being implemented anyway. So to move on now to the next very brief clip, which is only about 20 seconds long. Economic activity is one of the things human beings do. It's not the only thing, and it's not the thing which necessarily determines the rules for every other thing that human beings do. So I think you're losing the plot here, because who doesn't know that economic activity isn't the only thing that human beings do? And then when you talk about the rules here, you kind of have an emotional breakdown. And I have told you over and over again that you should just keep the rules and stop splitting hairs on ethical issues because you're not grown up enough. So just keep the rules. Once again, Rowan, and as I said before, don't even concentrate on all of the rules. It's too much for you. Just concentrate on this one. Stop lying all the time.
Economic activity is one of the things human beings do. It's not the only thing, and it's not the thing which necessarily determines the rules for every other thing human beings do.
If we wanted to restore the civic environment of capitalist activity, I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. It sounds very impressive. It's just more noise pollution, isn't it? Doesn't mean anything. We might want, for example, to ask how we normalise a higher level of stakeholding by labour, and then you add briefly in capitalist enterprises, like you don't want anyone to hear it. Well, what does that mean then? Is it about employees owning shares in the company or that kind of thing? What does that mean? We might want to ask how we avoid that spiral of the securitisation of fictional or toxic assets that brought about the financial crash. And then you add again of 2008, like you don't want anyone to hear that either. So you might be talking about me having a financial crash due to being thrown out of my job because of your psychopathic scumbag behaviour. But anyway, I have told you before what brought about the financial crash in 2008. It was the collapse of the housing bubble in the United States. And the reason that the bubble was inflated in the first place was because of government regulation that insisted that lenders lent to people who were very high risk and who they knew perfectly well weren't going to be able to repay the loans. So that's how the financial crash came about in 2008, the collapse of the housing bubble in the United States, which was entirely caused by government regulation, because the private lenders didn't want to lend to people who wouldn't be able to pay back the money. So the government caused the crash, not the private people who were lending money that they didn't want to lend. We might want to ask how we create transparent and just tax regimes across the world. So this is communism then, transparent and just tax regimes. The assumption being that there has to be a tax regime and there aren't any other alternatives. That's one of the planks of the Communist Manifesto, Rowan. It's not capitalism. Keep in our sights the still uncomfortably prevalent culture of squirreling resources in tax havens of one kind or another. Well, if there wasn't so much tax, then there wouldn't be any need for tax havens, would there? So, tax havens are also a product of the communist system. We might want to ask how to disincentivise destabilising currency transactions taking over from the actual exchange of goods. I don't even know anything about currency transactions, so I won't say anything about that. And all of those things, I think, would be a perfectly reasonable part of any imaginable political proposal to humanise capitalism. It's communism that needs humanising because it's an ideology, whereas capitalism is just free transactions between human beings, not regulated or controlled by any outside force. So capitalism is already humane or humanised in its essence. It's a creation of human beings, whereas communism is a creation of despotic dictators who want to be in control of everything and everybody and to steal all the resources of the world for themselves.
If we wanted to restore the civic environment, of capitalist activity. We might want, for example, to ask how we normalize a higher level of stakeholding by labor in capitalist enterprises. We might want to ask how we avoid that spiral of the securitization of fictional or toxic assets that brought about the financial crash of 2008. We might want to ask how to create transparent and just tax regimes across the world and keep in our sights the still uncomfortably prevalent culture of squirreling resources in tax havens of one kind or another. We might want to ask, thinking back to what Barbara mentioned at the beginning, we might want to ask how to disincentivize destabilizing currency transactions, taking over from the actual exchange of goods. And all of those things, I think, would be a perfectly reasonable part of any imaginable political proposal to humanize capitalism.
So I've decided now to eliminate another short clip, so I'm only actually talking about 7 of the 9 short clips from this lecture that you gave at the beginning of November. So you go on to say, in conclusion, can capitalism be ethical? No, you say, the same way that an adult would say no to a child who was about to burn itself on a hot oven. So it's great that we've got you, such an amazingly impressive grown-up, to be telling us not to burn ourselves on capitalism. So you say, no, not on its own. It can't even be coherent or self-sustaining on its own. Well, this is completely ridiculous. That's communism that you're talking about. Communism can't be self-sustaining on its own. It always collapses. And the Soviet Union was being propped up by the United States and Canada through virtually all of its existence. So it's communism that isn't self-sustaining, not capitalism. I don't even know what you mean by coherence. Capitalism isn't an ideology. It's a system of trade. Communism is an artificial ideology that certain dictators in history have tried to impose on populations who largely reject it. And so you say, and in the light of all that, the main job that we have, I would say, is to recognise with a greater clarity than perhaps we had in the past the focal ethical risk within capitalist practice, which is what I've called the reduction of all relationships to ownership, purchase and commodity. Well, this is complete nonsense because in a capitalist system, not all your relationships are related to capital, are they? It's only your business transactions and your commercial transactions, such as making things and buying and selling things, that are related to ownership, purchase and commodity. Your personal relationships are not what you'd call capitalist interactions, are they? The point is about capitalism is that it allows people the freedom to make decisions about other areas of their life, and it's the best system that has existed so far in history for supplying a surplus, really, of what we need and enabling the larger number of people to prosper. Communism never achieved that and ended up murdering millions of people. Or communist dictators did, rather. And the reduction of all motivation to acquisitiveness, the reduction of all rationality to calculation. Well, motivation to acquisitiveness isn't reducing a motivation to acquisitiveness, rather, isn't capitalism. You can simply get your basic needs if you want. That's your choice. Acquisitiveness is consumerism. It isn't capitalism. So you're criticising capitalism for things that aren't intrinsically part of its nature. And actually, the globalists who control you are promoting consumerism. So to make people think that they need certain large amounts of consumer items, should I say, in order to validate themselves. Whereas in only the recent past, more people would have been more easily validated by other means, by their family or community or their sense of themselves or their religion or their ethical system or something like that. And consumerism is pushing the idea that you need a certain amount of consumer goods in order to be validated as a human being and to have a worthwhile life. So that isn't capitalism, it's consumerism promoted by the globalists who control you, which makes people easier to control if they feel that they can't survive without consumer goods. I'm not talking about the basic necessities of life, I'm talking about things that you might consider to be surplus to the need to survive. And the reduction of all rationality to calculation. Well, you haven't got any rationality at all, have you? Because you never present any evidence for your arguments. It's just impressionistic bullshit all the time, and techniques of neuro-linguistic programming and other psychological techniques to try and manipulate your audience into going along with what you say and manipulate your victims into giving you what you want. So you say, in capitalism, the human race has created a potentially lethal monster. Well, capitalism wasn't created in the same sense that communism was created. Communism is an ideology. Capitalism isn't an ideology as such. It's just a system of free association and free trade, and people can make independent decisions within that. Obviously, if you have more wealth, then you have more freedom. But even poorer people have relatively more freedom than they would have in a communist system. So communism is an ideology that's been created, an artificial ideology, and it's not a potentially lethal monster, it's an actual lethal monster, because communist dictators killed nearly 100 million people in the 20th century. So that's what always happens in communist systems. So capitalism isn't a lethal monster. Capitalism actually never killed anybody. Some people died in accidents. Some people died because people behaved in an immoral way and didn't take care of safety or whatever. But capitalism doesn't cause that to happen. Whereas with communism, it's impossible to implement communism without a totalitarian state. So communism is a lethal monster and capitalism isn't. So you say, like many of the other potentially lethal monsters human beings have created, like nuclear armaments. Well, capitalism wasn't created as such because it's not an ideology like communism. It was more that people found with industrialization that this was the best way to order society and to get, for the majority of people, to get the things that they wanted. And of course, on an individual basis, people make decisions according to that, and some people decide to start businesses and some people decide to work in businesses, or maybe they don't have an option but to work in businesses, but they've still got relative freedom in every other area of their life. The problem is you can't uninvent it. Well, it wasn't really invented in the first place, whereas communism was. Oh, by the way, you're now looking at a diagram of a Freemasonic sign, which you will hopefully have noticed is the same sign that Karl Marx was making in the photos of him that I've been showing in earlier parts of the video. That was Karl Marx in the photo making the sign of the second veil or whatever it is of Freemasonry, and he was recruited by a secret society to write the Communist Manifesto. So there's some information about that a bit later in the video. You can't ignore it, and you can only, with difficulty, suppress it. So why are you trying to suppress free association and free trade, then, Rowan? What's the purpose of that? To bring in a dictatorial one-world government and to pretend that you're doing that out of compassion and care for the poor and people in the third world and all these other people that you've labelled as minorities and disadvantaged people, who you're really just using as a tool to bring down the stronger and more prosperous societies in the world, which happen to be in the West. So that our question is whether it can be socialised. Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? You mean socialised in terms of socialism, really, there, don't you? You want capitalism socialised, so it'll no longer be capitalism, it will become socialism with a view to becoming communism, because that's the end goal of socialism, communism. Whether the Frankenstein's creation we have generated can manage to speak, to be within a culture that it doesn't control, to converse with a cultural environment, not to devour it. So this is quite bizarre what you're saying here, and I think you're talking about Frankenstein's creation because I just made a Happy Halloween video for you 2 days before. Where I said you would be out sacrificing virgins and your wife would be flying around on her broomstick. So this is why I think you're mentioning Frankenstein's creation here. We have generated, can manage to speak. Well, how can capitalism speak? To be within a culture that it doesn't control, to converse with a cultural environment, not to devour it. I can't even be bothered to work out what that's supposed to mean. It's just more complete and utter lunacy, I think. There's probably some hidden message in there for me, but I really don't know what it is and I don't care. And you're emphasising the words speak, within, and converse. Well, I am conversing with you, Rowan. It's not my fault if you don't like what I'm saying. Oh, except, of course, it's Schrodinger's conversation, isn't it? Which is both happening and not happening at the same time, according to your evil old hag of a wife. Who's probably out flying round on her broomstick right now. Whether we can or cannot achieve that isn't at all clear at the moment. But I would submit that the challenge is real and urgent, and that the possibilities are finite but strong. So that doesn't even really make any sense either. It's just more noise pollution. You emphasise real and urgent. So it's not at all clear. I think you're musing over the fact that it's not clear that you can achieve what you want. Well, I'm telling you now, you're not achieving anything with me. Zip your trousers up and fuck off. But I would submit, oh, does this mean you're really looking for a dominatrix and you want me to kick you in the balls? Is this you tipping me the wink to kick you in the balls? I'll need a bit more confirmation than that, Rowan. So let me know, won't you? That the challenge is real and urgent, and that the possibilities are finite but strong. I think you're probably talking about S&M there again. Anyway, I shan't say any more tonight because this video is probably about 5 hours long by now. So I'll leave it there, but obviously I'm going to be dreaming about my beloved all night long, and I can't wait till we can be together forever because he's so wonderful and we're made for each other. And I still can't wait to get my hands on those feet. I just feel like I've been waiting forever. He's just so handsome and sexy. It's got such a sexy voice with his North Wales accent. Anyway, I will leave it there, but don't forget to be alert because I will be turning up to make a citizen's arrest. For example, tomorrow, when you're speaking in Church House in London, and I've got my ticket already. So, hasta mañana.
In conclusion, can capitalism be ethical? No, not on its own. It can't even be coherent or self-sustaining on its own. And in the light of all that, the main job that we have, I would say, is to recognize, with a greater clarity than perhaps we've had in the past, the focal ethical risk within capitalist practice, which is what I've called the reduction of all relationships to ownership, purchase, commodity. The reduction of all motivation to acquisitiveness. The reduction of all rationality to calculation. In capitalism, the human race has created a potentially lethal monster. Like many of the other potentially lethal monsters human beings have created, like nuclear armaments, the problem is you can't uninvent it, you can't ignore it, and you can only with difficulty suppress it. So that our question is whether it can be socialized, whether the Frankenstein's creation we have generated can manage to speak, to be within a culture that it doesn't control, to converse with the cultural environment, not to devour it. Whether we can or cannot achieve that isn't at all clear at the moment. But I would submit that the challenge is real and urgent, and that the possibilities are finite but strong.
So Marx had to flee to England after a failed revolutionary attempt in 1848, and it was just monstrous. Things just went worse and worse. So they now had 3 children, Jenny, Laura, and Edgar, and gave birth to a 4th, whose name was either Guy or Guido. And 5 months after Guy or Guido was born, they were evicted from their rooms in Chelsea for non-payment of rent. And they were turned out on the pavement, and the entire mob of Chelsea was out there staring at this. Their beds were sold to pay the butcher, the milkman, the chemist, and the baker. This is important because Marx dislikes exploitation of the working class. He takes their stuff and doesn't pay them. Do you understand? This is a fat man's diet book. Do you understand? He says, don't exploit the workers. He takes stuff from the butcher, the milkman, the chemist, the baker, who are all workers, and he doesn't pay his bills. He's not just exploiting the workers, he's stealing from the workers. Exploitation is an unequal economic relationship. Thieving is a completely predatory economic relationship. So, can you imagine? I mean, saying I am too busy writing about the exploitation of the working class to pay the working class who keep me alive. Holy Fight Club. Let's go directly to Paul Johnson's book for this last bit. Horrendous. There was, however, one curious, obscure survivor of this tragic family, the product of Marx's most bizarre act of personal exploitation. In all his researches into the iniquities of British capitalists, he came across many instances of low-paid workers, but he never succeeded in unearthing one who was paid literally no wages at all. Yet such a worker did exist in his own household. When Marx took his family on their formal Sunday walks, bringing up the rear, carrying the picnic basket and other impedimenta, there was a stumpy female figure. This was Helen Demuth, known in the family as Lenchen. Born in 1823 of peasant stock, she had joined the von Westphalen family at the age of 8 as a nursery maid. She got her keep but was paid nothing. In 1845, the Baroness, who felt sorrow and anxiety for her married daughter, gave Lenchen, then 22, to Jenny Marx to ease her lot. She remained in the Marx family until her death in 1890. Eleanor called her the most tender of beings to others, while throughout her life a stoic to herself. She was a ferociously hard worker, not only cooking and scrubbing, but managing the family budget, which Jenny, Marx's wife, was incapable of handling. Marx never paid her a penny. Remember Marx, that guy who was ferocious about the exploitation of the working class? Never paid his maid a penny, essentially turning her into a housebound slave. But it gets worse. In 1849 to 1850, during the darkest period of the family's existence, Lenchen became Marx's mistress and conceived a child. The little boy Guido had recently died, but Jenny too was pregnant again. The whole household was living in 2 rooms, and Marx had to conceal Lenchen's state not only from his wife, but from his endless revolutionary visitors. Eventually, Jenny found out, or had to be told, and on top of her other miseries at this time, it probably marked the end of her love for Marx. Lenchen's child was born at the Soho address, 28 Dean Street, on 23 June 1851. It was a son, registered as Henry Frederick Demuth. Marx refused to acknowledge his responsibility, then or ever, and flatly denied the rumors that he was the father. He may well have wished to do a Rousseau and put the child in an orphanage or have him permanently adopted, but Lenchen was a stronger character than Rousseau's mistress. She insisted on acknowledging the boy herself. He was put out to be fostered by a working-class family called Lewis, but allowed to visit the Marx household. He was, however, forbidden to use the front door and obliged to see his mother only in the kitchen. Marx was terrified that Freddie's paternity would be discovered and that this would do him fatal damage as a revolutionary leader and seer. One obscure reference to the event survives in his letters. Others have been suppressed by various hands. He eventually persuaded Engels to acknowledge Freddie privately as a cover story for family consumption. That, for instance, was what Eleanor believed, but Engels, though prepared as usual to submit himself to Marx's demands for the sake of their joint work, was not willing to take the secret to the grave. Engels died of cancer of the throat on 5th August 1895, unable to speak, but unwilling that Eleanor, Tussie as she was called, should continue to think her father unsullied. He wrote on a slate, "Freddie is Marx's son. Tussie wants to make an idol of her father." Engels's secretary housekeeper Louise Freiberger, in a letter to August Bebel of 2nd September 1898, said Engels himself told her the truth, adding, "Freddie looks ridiculously like Marx, with that typically Jewish face and blue-black hair. It was really only blind prejudice that could see in him any resemblance to General," her name for Engels. Eleanor herself accepted that Freddie was her half-brother and became attached to him. 9 of her letters to him have survived. She did not bring him any luck, since her lover, Aveling, succeeded in borrowing Freddie's life savings, which were never repaid. The other knowledgeable man was Engels himself, who had interest in factories, but Marx declined Engels' invitation to accompany him on a visit to a cotton mill, and so basically, as far as is known, Marx never set foot in a mill or a factory or a mine or any industrial workplace the whole of his life. So Engels was his partner, his bitch, basically, and was a co-author and a funder, particularly the last third of Marx's life. So in March 1946, Marx subjected a man named William Weitling to a kind of trial before the meeting of the Communist League in Brussels. Weitling was a true working-class hero, a poor, illegitimate son of a laundress, never had any idea who his father was. He was a tailor's apprentice, very smart, self-educated, a very hard worker. He won himself a large following among German workers. And what Marx did was he basically subjected him to a trial to put down this guy who was a working-class hero who lacked the abstract philosophical training that Marx felt was essential to the revolution. So Marx said that Weitling was guilty of conducting an agitation without doctrine. And he said, "This is all fine in barbarous Russia, where you can build up successful unions with stupid young men and apostles. But in a civilized country like Germany, you must realize that nothing can be achieved without our doctrine." He said, "If you attempt to influence the workers, especially the German workers, without a body of doctrine and clear scientific ideas, then you are merely playing an empty and unscrupulous game of propaganda, leading inevitably to the setting up on the one hand of an inspired apostle and on the other of open-mouthed donkeys listening to him." Weitling replied, he said, "I didn't become a socialist to learn about doctrines manufactured in a library. I speak for actual working men and will not submit to the views of mere theoreticians who are remote from the suffering of real labor." And this, said an eyewitness, so enraged Marx that he struck his fist on the table so violently that the lamp shook. Jumping to his feet, he shouted, "Any uppity working-class type who lacked the philosophical training he thought essential was a monster and should have nothing to do with anything." He said, "Ignorance has never solved any problem." And there's another guy named Lassalle who became the victim of Marx's most brutal anti-Semitic and racial sneers. He was Baron Itzig, the Jewish nigger. He said, "He's a greasy Jew," this is Marx's words, "a greasy Jew disguised under brilliantine and cheap jewels. It is now perfectly clear to me," Marx wrote to Engels on 30th July 1862, "that as the shape of his head and the growth of his hair indicates, he is descended from the Negroes who joined in Moses' flight from Egypt. Unless his mother or grandmother on his father's side was crossed with a nigger, the union of Jew and German on a Negro base was bound to produce an extraordinary hybrid." So Marx didn't actually investigate working conditions himself, despite access to factories through Engels. He did not learn from intelligent working men who had experienced them. And Karl Jaspers, who is a philosopher, in particular a philosopher of science, he said, the style of Marx's writings is not that of the investigator. He does not quote examples or adduce facts which run counter to his own theory, but only those which clearly support or confirm that which he considers the ultimate truth. The whole approach is one of vindication, not investigation, but it is a vindication of something proclaimed as the perfect truth, with the conviction not of the scientist, but of the believer. And this is basic to...
Communism is most oftenly promoted as a political philosophy to help the average worker, the proletariat, fight against the, quote, oppressive business owners called the bourgeoisie. But it's actually a conspiracy controlled by the Illuminati, who have created and used communism as a mechanism to encourage the creation of an all-powerful super state. As Gary Allen puts it in his 1970s book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, quote, "Communism is not a movement of the downtrodden masses, but is a movement created, manipulated by, and used by power-seeking billionaires in order to gain control over the world, first by establishing socialist governments in various nations, and then consolidating them through the great merger into an all-powerful socialist super-state under the auspices of the United Nations." The Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and his often overlooked co-author Friedrich Engels, first published in 1848, is widely believed to have sparked the communist revolution in Russia in 1917 and spreading to other countries such as North Korea in 1948, China in 1949, starting the Chinese Communist Revolution, and years later moving to Cuba in 1953. But what most people overlook is that Karl Marx was really just a secretary who wrote the book outlining the communist philosophy for a secret society of the Communist League. The manifesto itself reads, quote, "The Communist League, formerly the League of the Just, which could, of course, only be a secret one, commissioned the undersigned," meaning Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, "at the Congress held in London in November of 1847 to draw up for publication a detailed theoretical and practical program of the party." It goes on to say that such was the origin of the following manifesto, the manuscript of which traveled to London to be printed a few weeks before the February Revolution.
Don't try to change me, you're wasting your time. Now I got something much better in mind. Robert De Niro's waiting, talking Italian.
have the best sex.
Adelante.